The morning sun was still climbing over the rocky hills when the stagecoach started its journey to Tucson. Elizabeth sat by the window, watching the desert landscape roll by. She was traveling to meet her brother who worked at a mining camp. Her whole life was packed in one small bag beside her. The other passengers seemed nice enough. There was an old man going to visit his son, a young couple heading to their new home, and a businessman with papers spread across his lap. The driver, Pete, had been driving these routes for 15 years. His partner, Jake, rode shotgun, keeping watch for trouble. Everything seemed normal until they stopped at Willow Creek Station to change horses. Elizabeth noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. Even the birds weren't singing. Pete noticed it too. He kept looking around while the fresh horses were being hitched up. "Something doesn't feel right," Jake whispered to Pete. But they had a schedule to keep, and the next town was only a few hours away. They had been riding for maybe an hour when the first shot rang out. Elizabeth saw Jake grab his shoulder and nearly fall off the coach. Then more shots came from behind the rocks on both sides of the trail. Pete tried to speed up the horses, but it was too late. Men on horseback came charging out of their hiding spots, whooping and firing their guns in the air. Their faces were covered with bandanas and their hats were pulled low. These were the Valdez brothers and their gang, known throughout the territory for robbing coaches and showing no mercy to anyone who got in their way. "Stop the coach or we'll shoot everyone inside," shouted the leader, a man with cold, dark eyes and a scar running down his left cheek. Pete had no choice. He pulled the horses to a stop in a cloud of dust. His hands were shaking as he raised them up. Jake was bleeding badly from his shoulder wound, barely staying upright in his seat. "Everyone out, nice and slow," the leader ordered. "Keep your hands where we can see them." Elizabeth's heart was beating so fast she could barely breathe. The other passengers looked terrified. The old man was praying quietly. The young woman was crying into her husband's shoulder. The bandits went through everyone's belongings, taking money, jewelry, and anything else that looked valuable. They laughed and joked as they worked, like this was just another day for them. "Please," the businessman begged. "I have children at home. Just take the money and let us go." The leader just smiled that cold smile. "Sorry, friend. Can't have witnesses telling tales about where they saw us." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard stories about what happened to people who crossed paths with the Valdez gang. Very few lived to tell about it. While the bandits were busy counting their stolen goods, Elizabeth noticed something. One of the horses had wandered away from the group and was standing near some large rocks about 50 yards away. If she could somehow get to those rocks, maybe she could hide until the bandits left. She waited for the right moment. When the leader was arguing with one of his men about how to divide up the money, Elizabeth slowly backed away from the group. Step by step, she moved toward the rocks, trying not to make any noise. She almost made it. She was just a few feet from the rocks when one of the bandits turned around and saw her. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" he shouted. Elizabeth didn't think. She just ran. She heard the man yell for the others, heard boots hitting the ground as they chased after her. She ran faster than she had ever run in her life, jumping over small bushes and dodging around cacti. Behind her, she heard terrible sounds, gunshots, screaming. Then silence. Her blood ran cold as she realized what had happened to the other passengers. She couldn't stop running now. These men would kill her without a second thought. The desert was rough and unforgiving. Sharp rocks cut through her shoes. Thorny plants tore at her dress and scratched her arms and legs. The sun was getting higher and hotter and she had no water. But she kept running, driven by pure fear. After what felt like hours, she could no longer hear the sound of horses behind her. She stopped behind a large boulder to catch her breath and listen. The desert was quiet except for the sound of her own heavy breathing and the beating of her heart. She was alone. Completely alone in the middle of nowhere with no food, no water, and no idea which direction to go. The sun was now directly overhead, and the heat was becoming unbearable. Her throat was already dry and her lips were starting to crack. Elizabeth looked around at the endless expanse of desert. Red rocks and sand stretched as far as she could see in every direction. There were no roads, no buildings, no signs of life anywhere. Just heat, rocks, and thorny plants that seemed to want to hurt her. She tried to remember what her brother had told her about the desert. "If you ever get lost," he had said, "find shade and wait for the sun to go down. Travel at night when it's cooler. And always, always conserve your water." But she had no water to conserve, and the nearest shade was a small overhang about 100 yards away. She made her way there slowly, already feeling dizzy from the heat and fear. Under the rocky overhang, she tried to think clearly. The bandits might still be looking for her. They knew she could identify them, which made her dangerous to them. But they also might think the desert would kill her anyway, so why bother chasing her? As the day wore on, the heat became almost unbearable. Elizabeth's dress was soaked with sweat and her mouth felt like it was full of cotton. She tried to stay in the shade, but even there, the temperature must have been over 100 degrees. When the sun finally started to go down, painting the sky in beautiful shades of orange and pink, Elizabeth knew she had to start moving. But which way? Every direction looked the same. She picked what she hoped was east toward where the towns would be and started walking. The desert at night was a different kind of dangerous. It was cooler, which was a relief, but it was also completely dark. She could barely see where she was stepping. Strange sounds came from the darkness around her. Howls and screeches that made her skin crawl. After stumbling and falling several times, Elizabeth found herself at the edge of what must have been a creek bed, though there was no water in it now. She was exhausted, thirsty, and more scared than she had ever been in her life. She collapsed against a large rock, too tired to go any further. Her whole body ached and her throat felt like sandpaper. She looked up at the stars, so bright and clear in the desert sky, and wondered if anyone would ever find her out here. As she sat there in the darkness, Elizabeth heard something that made her freeze. Footsteps. Soft, careful footsteps coming toward her through the darkness. Had the bandits found her after all? She held her breath and tried to make herself as small as possible against the rock. The footsteps stopped just a few feet away from her hiding spot. Elizabeth closed her eyes and waited for the worst. Thomas Crowfeather moved through the desert like he was part of it. His moccasins made no sound on the rocky ground. His dark eyes missed nothing as he followed the trail left by the Valdez gang. Every broken twig, every disturbed stone told him a story. He had been tracking these bandits for 3 days now. The territorial marshal in Phoenix had hired him because he was the best tracker in Arizona Territory. Half Apache, half Mexican, Thomas lived between two worlds and belonged fully to neither. The white settlers needed his skills but never trusted him completely. His Apache relatives thought he had sold out to the white man's law. Thomas didn't care much what either side thought anymore. He did his job, took his pay, and tried not to think too much about the past. But the past had a way of following him everywhere he went. The trail was easy to follow. The bandits weren't trying to hide their tracks. They were confident, maybe too confident. Thomas had counted at least 6 horses heavily loaded. They had hit another stagecoach. That much was clear from the wheel marks and the scattered papers he had found near Willow Creek Station. As the sun began to set, Thomas noticed something different in the tracks. One set of footprints had broken away from the main group. Small feet running hard. A woman's shoes from the look of them. Someone had escaped from the coach and was running for their life. Thomas followed the new trail as darkness fell. The footprints told a story of desperation. The person was stumbling, falling, getting back up and running again. They were heading roughly east, but in the darkness they were wandering off course. The trail led to an old creek bed that had been dry for months. Thomas moved carefully along the sandy bottom, reading the signs by starlight. His Apache grandfather had taught him to track in all conditions, day or night. The earth always tells the truth, the old man used to say. You just have to know how to listen. Near a large boulder, the footprints stopped. Thomas crouched down and studied the ground more carefully. The person had sat here for a while, then moved behind the rock. They were hiding. Thomas heard the soft sound of frightened breathing coming from behind the boulder. Very slowly, very carefully, he moved around the rock. What he saw made him stop in his tracks. A young woman was pressed against the stone, her blonde hair matted with dust and sweat. Her dress was torn and dirty, and her arms were covered with scratches from the desert plants. She was trying to make herself invisible, her eyes squeezed shut like a child hiding from monsters. For a moment, Thomas couldn't move. The woman's hair, the way she held herself, even in the darkness, reminded him so strongly of Morning Star. His wife had been dead for 2 years now, but sometimes, in moments like this, the grief hit him like a physical blow. He forced himself to focus on the present. This woman was in serious trouble. She had no water, no food, and no knowledge of how to survive in the desert. If he left her here, she would be dead by morning. Thomas moved closer, making sure to step on a small stone so she would hear him coming. The last thing he wanted was to startle her into running again. The woman's eyes flew open when she heard the sound. In the starlight, Thomas could see the terror in her face. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat was too dry. "Don't be afraid," Thomas said quietly in English. He kept his hands where she could see them and moved very slowly. "I'm not going to hurt you." The woman stared at him, taking in his dark skin, his long black hair, and his buckskin clothes. She had probably never seen an Apache up close before. Most white people thought all Indians were bloodthirsty savages who scalped women and children. "Are you hurt?" Thomas asked, still speaking softly. The woman shook her head, though he could see she was far from fine. Thomas reached for the water bag hanging from his belt. The woman flinched when he moved, but he continued slowly until he could offer her the water. "Drink," he said. "Small sips." The woman hesitated for a moment, then grabbed the water bag with shaking hands. She drank greedily until Thomas gently pulled it away. "Too much too fast will make you sick," he explained. "I'll give you more in a few minutes." The woman wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and looked at him with confusion and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Thomas studied her face in the starlight. She was young, maybe 25, with kind eyes and a determined chin, but right now she looked like a frightened child. "What happened to you?" he asked. "Bandits," she managed to say. "They stopped our stagecoach." Everyone else, she couldn't finish the sentence, but Thomas understood. He had seen the Valdez gang's work before. They never left witnesses. This woman was incredibly lucky to have escaped, and incredibly unlucky to be alone in the desert with no supplies. "What's your name?" Thomas asked. "Elizabeth," she said. "Elizabeth Carter. I was going to Tucson to meet my brother." Thomas nodded. Tucson was 3 days away on foot if you knew exactly where you were going and had plenty of water. Elizabeth had neither. "I'm Thomas," he said. "I've been tracking the men who attacked your stagecoach." Elizabeth's eyes widened with hope. "Are you a lawman?" "I work for the law sometimes," Thomas said. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. "Right now, I'm hunting the men who hurt you." Elizabeth tried to stand up, but her legs were too weak. Thomas caught her arm and helped her sit back down. "I need to get to Tucson," she said. "My brother will be worried when I don't arrive." Thomas looked around at the dark desert. "It's too dangerous to travel now. The bandits might still be in the area, and the desert at night has its own dangers." "But I can't stay here," Elizabeth said, panic creeping into her voice. "They'll find me." Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking. The smart thing would be to take this woman to the nearest town and leave her there. But the nearest town was a full day's ride away, and he would lose the bandits' trail if he stopped now. The other option was more dangerous, but it might be the only way to keep her alive. "There is another way," Thomas said slowly, "but you won't like it." Elizabeth looked at him with desperate eyes. "I'll do anything. Please, just help me." Thomas studied her face again, seeing that same resemblance to Morning Star that had struck him so powerfully. Maybe it was fate that had brought this woman across his path. Maybe Morning Star's spirit was trying to tell him something. "The bandits know you escaped," Thomas said. "They'll be looking for a white woman traveling alone. But they won't be looking for an Apache woman traveling with her husband." Elizabeth stared at him, not understanding. "You would have to disguise yourself," Thomas explained. "Dress like an Apache woman. Act like an Apache woman. Let them think you are my wife." The idea was crazy and Thomas knew it, but it might be crazy enough to work. The Valdez gang knew him by reputation. They sometimes hired him to track people for them, though they didn't know he was also working for the law. If they thought Elizabeth was his wife, they might leave her alone. Would that really work? Elizabeth asked. Thomas was honest with her. "Maybe, or maybe we'd both end up dead. It's a big risk." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, thinking about her options. Stay here and die of thirst in the desert, try to travel alone and probably get caught by the bandits, or trust this strange man who had appeared out of the darkness like an answer to her prayers. "If I agree to this," she said finally, "what would I have to do?" Thomas looked up at the stars, thinking about his dead wife and the cruel tricks that fate sometimes played on people. "You would have to become someone else," he said quietly. "You would have to become my wife who died 2 winters ago. You would have to become Morning Star." Elizabeth stared at Thomas in the darkness, trying to understand what he was asking of her. Pretend to be his dead wife? The idea seemed impossible and frightening. I don't understand, she said. How could I pretend to be someone I've never met? And why would the bandits believe it? Thomas was quiet for a moment, looking up at the stars. When he spoke again, his voice was filled with old pain. My wife's name was Morningstar. She was Apache from the White Mountain Band. We lived together for 5 years before the fever took her. He paused, and Elizabeth could see the grief still fresh on his face. The Valdez gang knew her. They sometimes came to our camp when they needed information about army movements or safe places to hide. Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. You worked with those murderers? I did what I had to do to survive, Thomas said simply. In this territory, you take work where you find it. But I never helped them hurt innocent people. I just tracked animals for them, found water, things like that. Elizabeth tried to process this information. The man who had saved her life had connections to the very people who had killed the other passengers on the stagecoach. Should she trust him, or should she try to run again? As if reading her thoughts, Thomas said, I know what you're thinking. But if I wanted to hurt you, I could have done it already. And if I wanted to turn you over to the Valdez gang, I wouldn't need to make up a story about you being my wife. Elizabeth knew he was right. She had no choice but to trust him. Without his help, she would die in this desert. Tell me about your wife, she said. What was she like? Thomas's face softened when he spoke about Morningstar. She was beautiful, but not in the way white people think of beauty. She was strong. She could ride as well as any man, track game through country that would confuse a bloodhound, and make a camp comfortable with nothing but what the desert provided. He reached into a leather pouch on his belt and pulled out something that glinted in the starlight. It was a necklace made of silver and turquoise with intricate beadwork that must have taken months to create. She made this herself, Thomas said, holding the necklace carefully in his hands. She was wearing it when the fever took her. I've carried it with me ever since. Elizabeth could see how much the necklace meant to him. The idea of wearing it, of pretending to be the woman who had made it, felt like a terrible violation. I can't, she whispered. It wouldn't be right. That necklace belongs to her memory. Thomas studied Elizabeth's face in the starlight. Morningstar would understand. She always helped people in need. If she knew that wearing her necklace could save your life, she would insist on it. Elizabeth was still hesitant. But what if the bandits realize I'm not her? What if they remember something about her that I get wrong? That's a risk we'll have to take, Thomas admitted. But you have some advantages. Morningstar died 2 years ago, so they won't be expecting to see her, and they only met her a few times. They know she was my wife, they know she was Apache, and they know she's supposed to be dead. If we're careful, we might be able to convince them that you're her spirit returned from the dead. The idea made Elizabeth shiver. Her spirit? Apache beliefs about death are different from white beliefs, Thomas explained. Sometimes when someone dies with unfinished business or strong emotional ties to the living world, their spirit can return to complete what they left undone. The Valdez gang has been around Apaches long enough to have heard these stories. They might believe that Morningstar's spirit came back to be with me. Elizabeth thought about this. It was a complicated deception, but it might work. And it was certainly better than dying alone in the desert. What would I have to do? She asked. Thomas began explaining the basics. First, we need to change how you look. Your hair is too light and too clean. We'll darken it with mud and ash. Your skin is too pale, but the desert sun will help with that if we have a few days. He continued describing the transformation. You'll need to wear Apache clothes. I still have some of Morningstar's things. You'll need to learn some basic Apache words, especially for yes or no and husband. Most importantly, you'll need to act like an Apache wife. What does that mean? Elizabeth asked. Apache women are strong and independent, but they also show respect for their husbands in public. You'll need to keep your eyes down when the bandits are around. Don't speak unless they speak to you first. Stay close to me and let me do most of the talking. Elizabeth nodded, trying to remember everything he was telling her. It seemed like a lot to learn, especially when her life might depend on getting it right. Thomas reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a bundle wrapped in soft leather. These were Morningstar's clothes, he said, handing the bundle to Elizabeth. You should change into them now while it's dark. I'll turn away. Elizabeth took the bundle with trembling hands. The leather was soft and well cared for, and she could smell the faint scent of sage and wood smoke clinging to the fabric. These clothes had belonged to a real person, a woman who had loved and been loved, who had lived and died in this harsh desert country. Thomas turned his back while Elizabeth changed into Morningstar's clothes. The dress was made of soft deerskin, decorated with beadwork and patterns of blue and white. It fit her surprisingly well, though it was a little loose in the shoulders. She was taller than me, Elizabeth said when she was finished changing. Thomas turned around and looked at her. Even in the darkness, Elizabeth could see the pain flash across his face when he saw her wearing his wife's clothes. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said quickly. "This must be very difficult for you." Thomas took a deep breath and composed himself. "We do what we must to survive," he said. Morningstar would understand. He took some mud from the dry creek bed and mixed it with ash from an old campfire. "This will darken your hair and skin," he said. "It won't be comfortable, but it will help with the disguise." Elizabeth sat still while Thomas carefully applied the mixture to her hair and face. His hands were gentle but impersonal, like a doctor treating a patient. When he was finished, Elizabeth looked down at her reflection in his water bag. She barely recognized herself. "Now for the most important part," Thomas said. He held up Morningstar's necklace. "This will be the final touch that convinces them you are who we say you are." Elizabeth hesitated again. "Are you sure about this? It feels wrong to wear something so personal." Thomas fastened the necklace around her neck with steady hands. The silver felt cool against her skin, and the turquoise stone seemed to glow in the starlight. Morningstar believed that objects could carry the spirits of their owners. Thomas said softly, "Maybe by wearing this you'll carry a little bit of her strength with you." Elizabeth touched the necklace gently. It was beautiful, but she could feel the weight of responsibility that came with wearing it. She was no longer just Elizabeth Carter, running for her life in the desert. She was now pretending to be Morningstar, a woman she had never met but whose clothes she wore and whose necklace rested against her heart. "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked. Thomas looked toward the east, where the first faint hint of dawn was beginning to show on the horizon. "Now we wait," he said. "The bandits will come looking for you when the sun rises. When they find us, you'll need to be ready to play the part of your life, because if they don't believe you're Morningstar, we'll both be dead before noon." As the first light of dawn painted the desert sky pink and gold, Thomas worked quickly to teach Elizabeth how to be an Apache wife. There was so little time, and so much depended on her getting it right. "The most important thing is your posture," Thomas said, watching Elizabeth practice sitting the way Morningstar used to sit. "Apache women are proud, but they don't challenge men directly in public. Keep your back straight, but your eyes down when the bandits are near." Elizabeth tried to copy the graceful way he showed her, but it felt awkward and unnatural. She had been raised to look people in the eye when she spoke to them, to stand up straight and speak her mind. Now she had to do the opposite of everything she had been taught. "How do I grind corn?" she asked, watching Thomas demonstrate with some dried corn he carried in his supplies. "Like this," he said, showing her how to use the flat stone to crush the kernels. Morningstar did this every morning. "The sound and the rhythm need to look natural, like you've done it 1,000 times before." Elizabeth practiced the grinding motion, trying to make it look effortless. Her hands were soft from her life in town, not tough and skilled like an Apache woman's hands would be. She hoped the bandits wouldn't look too closely. Thomas taught her a few basic Apache words that she might need. Husband was shije, yes was ao, no was duda. The words felt strange in her mouth, but she repeated them over and over until she could say them without hesitation. "What if they ask me questions?" Elizabeth asked nervously. "They probably won't talk to you directly," Thomas said. "Apache women usually don't speak to strange men unless their husbands give them permission. If they do ask you something, just nod or shake your head. If you must speak, keep your answers very short." The sound of horses in the distance made them both freeze. Thomas listened carefully, counting the hoofbeats. 6 riders, he said quietly. "Coming from the west." "It's them." Elizabeth felt her heart start racing. All their preparation was about to be put to the test. Thomas quickly arranged their small camp to look like they had been there all night. He scattered some ashes from an old fire and placed Elizabeth's torn white dress where it couldn't be seen. "Remember," he said urgently, "you are Morningstar. You died of fever 2 winters ago, but your spirit has returned to be with me. You're still weak from crossing between the worlds of the living and the dead. That's why you're quiet and why you might seem different from how they remember you. Elizabeth nodded, trying to calm her breathing. She sat down beside the grinding stone and began working the corn, just as Thomas had shown her. The repetitive motion helped steady her nerves a little. The sound of horses grew louder. Thomas stood up and shaded his eyes, looking toward the approaching riders like he was mildly curious but not alarmed. Elizabeth kept her eyes on the corn, grinding steadily and trying to look like this was just another ordinary morning. The bandits rode into their camp in a cloud of dust and jingling spurs. Elizabeth could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't look up. Her hands shook slightly as she continued grinding, and she hoped they would think it was just the motion of the work. "Well, well," said a voice with a thick Mexican accent. "If it isn't Thomas Crowfeather. What brings you to this part of the desert, amigo?" "Hunting," Thomas said simply. "Following a deer trail. It led me here to this old creek bed." Elizabeth recognized the voice as belonging to Rodriguez, the leader of the gang. She had heard him giving orders during the stagecoach robbery. Her blood ran cold at the memory, but she forced herself to keep grinding corn. "Hunting, eh?" Rodriguez said. "Have you seen anything else interesting out here? Like maybe a woman with yellow hair?" "Only my wife," Thomas replied calmly, gesturing toward Elizabeth. There was a long silence. Elizabeth could feel the bandits staring at her, and she fought the urge to look up and see their faces. Instead, she continued her work, trying to breathe normally. "Your wife?" said another voice, younger than Rodriguez's. "But didn't your wife die a couple years back?" "I remember hearing about that." Elizabeth's heart nearly stopped. Someone remembered that Morningstar was supposed to be dead. Their whole plan was falling apart before it had even really begun. Thomas's voice remained steady. "She did die. The fever took her body, but the spirits sometimes return to the living world when there are things left unfinished." "You're saying that's a ghost grinding corn?" The young bandit sounded skeptical and maybe a little nervous. "I'm saying the spirits work in ways that white men don't understand," Thomas replied. "Morningstar's love for me was stronger than death. Her spirit came back to me 3 moons ago." Elizabeth continued grinding, trying to look like a spirit made flesh. She kept her movements slow and deliberate, like someone not quite used to having a physical body again. Rodriguez urged his horse closer to where Elizabeth sat. She could smell the leather and sweat and gun oil that clung to him. Her instinct was to look up, to face this man who had murdered innocent people, but she forced herself to keep her eyes down. "Look at me, woman," Rodriguez commanded. Elizabeth slowly raised her eyes to meet his. Up close, she could see the cruelty in his dark eyes, the scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. This was a man who enjoyed causing pain. Rodriguez studied her face carefully. Elizabeth tried to keep her expression blank and distant, like a spirit who didn't quite belong in the world of the living. "She looks different," Rodriguez said finally. "Paler and thinner. Death changes a person," Thomas said. "Even when they return." One of the other bandits, a heavy-set man with a thick beard, pointed at Elizabeth's hands. "Those don't look like Indian hands to me. Too soft." Elizabeth's heart sank. She had known her hands would give her away. There was no way to fake the calluses and scars that came from years of hard work. But Thomas was ready for this. "Spirits don't do hard labor in the world beyond," he said. "Her hands are soft because she hasn't needed to use them for earthly work." The bearded bandit looked uncertain. "I don't know, Rodriguez. This whole thing feels wrong to me. Ghosts and spirits and such." "Maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Diego," Rodriguez snapped. He was still staring at Elizabeth, trying to decide what to believe. Elizabeth knew this was the most dangerous moment. If Rodriguez decided she was the escaped passenger from the stagecoach, both she and Thomas would be killed on the spot. She had to do something to convince him. Slowly, she reached up and touched the turquoise necklace around her throat. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper in the few Apache words Thomas had taught her. "Shijai," she said, looking at Thomas with what she hoped looked like otherworldly love. "My husband." The effect was immediate. Several of the bandits crossed themselves and muttered prayers in Spanish. Even Rodriguez looked shaken. "She's wearing Morningstar's necklace," whispered the young bandit who had questioned Thomas earlier. "I remember that necklace. She was wearing it the last time we saw her." Rodriguez continued to stare at Elizabeth, but she could see doubt creeping into his eyes. The necklace was the proof he needed. No living person would have Morningstar's most precious possession unless they were who they claimed to be. "Where did you come from?" Rodriguez asked Elizabeth directly. Elizabeth looked at Thomas as if asking permission to speak. He gave a small nod. "From the place where the spirits wait," she said softly, her voice still barely audible. "I came back because my heart was not finished with this world. It was the right thing to say." Apache beliefs about love transcending death were well known throughout the territory. The bandits might not understand the language, but they understood the emotion behind her words. Rodriguez finally turned away from Elizabeth and looked at Thomas. "We're looking for a white woman who escaped from a stagecoach yesterday. Yellow hair, blue dress. Have you seen anyone like that?" "No," Thomas said simply. "Only my wife and the spirits of this place." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "If you do see this woman, you'll let us know, won't you? There's good money in it." "Of course," Thomas replied. The bandits turned their horses to leave, but the young one looked back at Elizabeth one more time. "It really is her, isn't it?" he said to Rodriguez. "Morningstar, come back from the dead." Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. "Maybe," he said finally. "Or maybe Thomas Crow Feather is playing some kind of game with us. Either way, it's not our problem today." As the bandits rode away, Elizabeth continued grinding corn until the sound of their horses faded completely. Only then did she allow herself to collapse, her whole body shaking with relief and terror. Elizabeth thought the worst was over when the bandits rode away that first morning. She was wrong. Rodriguez and his men set up camp just 2 miles away, close enough that the smoke from their fires was visible on the horizon. "Why are they staying so close?" Elizabeth asked Thomas as they watched the distant smoke. Thomas's face was grim. "Rodriguez is suspicious. He's not completely convinced by our story, so he's keeping us where he can watch us." For 3 days, the bandits stayed nearby. Sometimes 1 or 2 of them would ride over to Thomas's camp, always with some excuse. They needed to water their horses. They wanted to know if Thomas had seen any game trails. They were looking for a good place to cross the mountains. But Elizabeth knew they were really there to study her, to look for any sign that she wasn't who she claimed to be. The constant fear was exhausting. Every time she heard hoofbeats, Elizabeth had to transform herself back into Morningstar. She had to become quiet and distant, moving like a spirit who didn't quite belong in the physical world. Thomas helped her practice during the quiet moments. He taught her more Apache words and showed her how Morningstar used to braid her hair. He told her stories about his wife's habits and mannerisms, things the bandits might remember. Morningstar always sang while she worked, Thomas said one evening as they sat by their small fire. She had a beautiful voice. Sometimes she sang traditional Apache songs, and sometimes she sang songs she made up herself. Elizabeth felt a pang of sadness. "I can't sing like she did. If they ask me to sing, they'll know I'm not her." "You won't have to sing exactly like her," Thomas explained. "Remember, you're supposed to be her spirit." Death would change even her voice. Despite the constant danger, Elizabeth found herself learning more about the woman she was pretending to be. Morningstar had been born in the mountains of eastern Arizona. She had learned to ride before she could walk properly. She could identify edible plants and track animals across rocky ground that left no obvious trail. "She sounds like she was an amazing person," Elizabeth said. Thomas nodded, staring into the fire. "She was. She could have married any warrior in the tribe, but she chose me instead, even though I was only half Apache. Even though her family thought she was making a mistake." Elizabeth could hear the love and loss in his voice. "How did you meet her?" "I was working as a scout for the army," Thomas said. "There had been some trouble between her band and the soldiers. I was sent to negotiate, to try to keep the peace. Morningstar was there as a translator because she spoke better English than most of the men." He smiled at the memory. She was fearless. She stood right up to the army captain and told him exactly what her people needed to avoid a war. She was maybe 20 years old, but she had the wisdom of someone much older. Elizabeth tried to imagine this strong, brave woman. It seemed impossible that she could ever measure up to Morningstar's memory, even in pretense. On the second day, Diego, the heavy-set bandit with the thick beard, rode into their camp alone. Elizabeth was mending one of Thomas's shirts when she heard the horse approaching. Quickly, she put down her work and picked up the corn grinding stone. "Buenos dias, Thomas," Diego said, dismounting from his horse. "Mind if I water my horse at your camp?" "Of course," Thomas replied. But Elizabeth could hear the tension in his voice. Diego led his horse to the small spring that Thomas had found near their camp. But instead of leaving after his horse had drunk its fill, he sat down on a rock and pulled out a piece of jerky to chew. Your wife doesn't talk much, Diego observed, looking directly at Elizabeth. Spirits have little need for conversation with the living, Thomas said calmly. Diego continued to stare at Elizabeth as she ground corn. My grandmother used to tell stories about spirits returning from the dead. She said they always came back for a purpose. What purpose does your wife have? It was a dangerous question. Thomas and Elizabeth hadn't prepared for this kind of detailed inquiry about Morningstar's supposed return. Thomas thought for a moment before answering. She came back because our love was not finished. In life we had planned to have children, to build a life together in the mountains. Death interrupted those plans. Diego nodded like this made sense to him. But spirits can't have children. They can't really build a life. So what happens when she realizes her purpose can't be fulfilled? Elizabeth felt a chill. This bandit was smarter than they had given him credit for. He was probing for weaknesses in their story. When that time comes, Thomas said quietly, she will return to the spirit world. Until then, I am grateful for whatever time we have together. Diego finished his jerky and stood up, but instead of leaving, he walked over to where Elizabeth was sitting. Stand up, he commanded. Elizabeth looked at Thomas, who gave a barely perceptible nod. Slowly, she rose to her feet, keeping her eyes downcast. Diego walked around her in a circle, studying her from every angle. Elizabeth could smell tobacco and sweat coming from his clothes. She forced herself to breathe normally and tried to imagine she was really a spirit, above earthly concerns like fear. You're taller than I remember, Diego said finally. Elizabeth's heart nearly stopped. This was exactly the kind of detail that could expose their deception. But Thomas was ready. Death stretches the spirit, he said. She is not quite the same as she was in life. Diego grunted, apparently accepting this explanation. Let me hear you speak, he said to Elizabeth. Elizabeth looked at Thomas again, still playing the role of an obedient Apache wife seeking her husband's permission. Speak, Thomas said gently. Elizabeth turned her gaze to Diego, trying to look through him rather than at him like a spirit might. What would you have me say? She asked softly. Tell me something only Morningstar would know, Diego challenged. Elizabeth's mind raced. She knew almost nothing about Morningstar's personal history. Nothing that these bandits would be able to verify. If she said the wrong thing, she and Thomas would both be dead within minutes. Then inspiration struck. She remembered something Thomas had told her about Apache beliefs regarding the dead. I know that you fear me, Elizabeth said, her voice barely above a whisper. I can see it in your eyes. You are afraid that if you anger me, I will call other spirits to haunt your dreams. Diego stepped back involuntarily. Elizabeth could see that her words had hit their mark. The bandit's face had gone pale under his dark beard. I also know, Elizabeth continued, that you carry a silver coin in your left pocket, the one you took from a merchant in Tombstone. The coin is cursed because you spilled blood to get it. This was a complete guess, but Elizabeth had noticed Diego unconsciously touching his left pocket several times during the conversation. Most bandits carried stolen coins, and many were superstitious about the items they took from their victims. Diego's hand flew to his pocket, confirming Elizabeth's guess. His eyes were wide with fear now. How do you know about the coin? He whispered. The dead know many things the living try to hide, Elizabeth replied. We see the shadows that follow you. Diego backed away from Elizabeth like she was on fire. He stumbled to his horse and mounted quickly, his hands shaking as he gathered the reins. I'm sorry to have bothered you, he stammered to Thomas. Please tell your wife I meant no disrespect. Diego rode away at a gallop, leaving a cloud of dust behind him. Thomas looked at Elizabeth with amazement. Where did that come from? Elizabeth collapsed back onto the ground, her legs too weak to hold her up. I don't know. I was so scared I thought I was going to faint. But then I remembered you saying that Apache spirits could see things hidden from the living. The coin? Thomas asked, a lucky guess. He kept touching his pockets, so I figured he had something valuable in there. And most bandits are superstitious about the things they steal from people they've killed. Thomas shook his head in admiration. You probably just convinced Diego that you really are a returned spirit. That was dangerous but brilliant. Elizabeth wasn't feeling brilliant. She was feeling terrified and exhausted. How much longer do we have to keep this up? Thomas looked toward the smoke from the bandits' camp. Until Rodriguez decides to move on. Could be days, could be weeks. Elizabeth touched Morningstar's necklace, which had become a source of strange comfort to her. Sometimes she felt like the real Morningstar was helping her, guiding her words and actions. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, "but I just hope I can keep fooling them." That night, as Elizabeth lay wrapped in Morningstar's blanket, she could hear the bandits talking and laughing around their distant campfire. She wondered if Diego was telling the others about his encounter with the spirit, who could see his secrets. She hoped so. The more the bandits feared her supernatural powers, the less likely they were to look too closely at the very human woman hiding behind the disguise. As the days passed, something unexpected began to happen between Elizabeth and Thomas. What had started as a desperate act of survival was slowly becoming something deeper and more complicated. Elizabeth found herself watching Thomas when he thought she wasn't looking. She noticed how gentle his hands were when he helped her with tasks she didn't understand. She saw how his eyes would grow distant and sad when he looked at her wearing Morningstar's clothes. She realized that every day of their deception was causing him pain, yet he never complained or asked her to stop. "Why are you doing this?" she asked him one evening as they sat by their small fire. The bandits' camp was visible in the distance, but for the moment they were alone. "What do you mean?" Thomas asked, though she could tell he knew exactly what she meant. "This hurts you," Elizabeth said simply. "Every time you look at me in her clothes, wearing her necklace, it brings back memories of losing her. So why are you putting yourself through this to save a stranger?" Thomas was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. "When I found you in the desert, you reminded me of her. Not just how you looked, but something else. A strength that you didn't even know you had." He picked up a stick and poked at the fire, sending sparks up into the dark sky. "Morningstar used to say that the spirits put people in our path for a reason. Maybe she sent you to me, or maybe I was meant to find you. I don't know. But I couldn't leave you to die." Elizabeth felt tears sting her eyes. No one had ever risked so much for her before. "I'm sorry this is so hard for you." "Don't be sorry," Thomas said. "Helping you has taught me something important." "What's that?" "That Morningstar's death doesn't have to be the end of my story. For 2 years I've been living like a ghost myself, just going through the motions of staying alive. But these past few days, taking care of you, protecting you, it's made me feel human again." Elizabeth understood what he meant. She had been feeling something similar. When she had boarded that stagecoach in Phoenix, she had been running away from a life that felt empty and meaningless. Her parents were dead, she had no close friends, and her job at the general store barely paid enough to survive. She had been going to Tucson not because she was excited about a new life, but because she couldn't think of anything else to do. But here in the desert, pretending to be Morningstar, she had discovered parts of herself she never knew existed. She had found courage she didn't know she possessed. She had learned to read the signs of the desert, to move quietly, to watch and listen with the intensity of someone whose life depended on paying attention. "What will happen when this is over?" Elizabeth asked. "When the bandits finally leave and I can stop pretending to be your wife?" Thomas looked at her across the fire. "What do you want to happen?" It was a fair question, but Elizabeth didn't have a simple answer. A week ago, she would have said she wanted to get to Tucson as quickly as possible, find her brother, and try to build some kind of normal life. But now the idea of returning to her old existence felt like putting on clothes that no longer fit. "I don't know," she admitted. "Everything has changed. I've changed." The next day brought a new test. Rodriguez himself rode into their camp, along with Carlos, the youngest member of the gang. Elizabeth could tell immediately that this visit was different from the others. Rodriguez's eyes were hard and calculating, and he dismounted from his horse with the slow deliberation of a man who had made up his mind about something. "Thomas, my friend," Rodriguez said with false warmth, "we need to talk." Elizabeth continued her morning routine of grinding corn, but every nerve in her body was alert. She could feel danger in the air, like the electricity that came before a thunderstorm. "Of course," Thomas replied calmly. "What's on your mind?" Rodriguez walked over to where Elizabeth was sitting and stood directly behind her. She could feel his presence like a cold shadow. "Carlos here has been thinking about your wife," Rodriguez said. "He's been remembering things about Morningstar, things that don't quite add up." Elizabeth's hands trembled slightly on the grinding stone, but she forced herself to continue working. This was the moment they had both been dreading. "What kind of things?" Thomas asked, his voice still steady. Carlos stepped forward, his young face serious. I remember Morningstar's laugh. She had this way of laughing that was like music. It was distinctive. But I haven't heard this woman laugh even once since we've been here. Elizabeth felt her heart sink. It was such a small detail, but Carlos was right. She had been so focused on staying quiet and mysterious that she had never once allowed herself to show joy or amusement. Spirits have little to laugh about, Thomas said. The world between life and death is not a happy place. Rodriguez wasn't satisfied with this answer. Carlos also remembers that Morningstar spoke Spanish. She learned it from her grandmother, who was captured by Mexican soldiers as a child. But this woman has only spoken Apache and English. This was worse. Elizabeth knew no Spanish beyond a few basic words. If they asked her to speak Spanish, the deception would be over immediately. Many memories fade when crossing between worlds, Thomas said. But Elizabeth could hear the strain in his voice now. Rodriguez smiled, but it was not a pleasant expression. Perhaps Carlos is right to be suspicious. Perhaps this woman is not who you claim she is. The tension in the camp was thick enough to cut with a knife. Elizabeth knew that within the next few minutes, either Rodriguez would be convinced of her identity, or she and Thomas would both be dead. Then Rodriguez spoke the words Elizabeth had been dreading to hear. If this is really Morningstar, he said, then she won't mind proving it. Carlos, tell her to speak to you in Spanish. Ask her about her grandmother's village. Elizabeth's mind went blank with panic. She looked at Thomas, hoping he would have some way to save them, but she could see from his expression that he was out of ideas. Carlos began speaking to her in rapid Spanish, asking questions about people and places she had never heard of. Elizabeth understood maybe one word in 10, and she had no idea how to respond. This was it. The moment their careful deception would finally fall apart. But then something unexpected happened. As Elizabeth sat there, paralyzed by fear and wearing Morningstar's necklace, words began to form in her mind. Spanish words. She didn't know where they came from or how she could possibly know them, but somehow she did. Mi abuela vivía en un pueblo pequeño cerca de las montañas. Elizabeth heard herself saying in perfect Spanish. Se llamaba Esperanza y tenía los ojos más tristes del mundo. Carlos's eyes went wide. He had asked about her grandmother's village, and Elizabeth had just told him that her grandmother lived in a small village near the mountains, that her name was Esperanza, and that she had the saddest eyes in the world. But Elizabeth had no memory of learning these words or these facts. It was as if someone else was speaking through her. Rodriguez looked stunned. What did she say? Carlos translated, his voice full of wonder. She said her grandmother lived in a small village near the mountains. Her name was Esperanza, and she had the saddest eyes in the world. Rodriguez stared at Elizabeth with a mixture of fear and respect. That's exactly what Morningstar told me about her grandmother. Word for word. Elizabeth sat very still, as confused as anyone about what had just happened. She felt the weight of mourning. Star's necklace against her skin, and wondered if the stories about objects carrying the spirits of their owners might actually be true. She is who she claims to be, Rodriguez said finally. No living person could know such details about Morningstar's family. As the bandits rode away, Thomas looked at Elizabeth with amazement and something that might have been fear. How did you know those words? He asked quietly. Elizabeth touched the turquoise necklace with trembling fingers. I don't know. They just came to me like someone was whispering them in my ear. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Morningstar's grandmother was named Esperanza. She was taken from her village as a child and raised by Mexican soldiers, and she did have the saddest eyes I ever saw. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. Are you saying that Morningstar, that her spirit actually... I don't know what I'm saying, Thomas admitted, but I do know that you just saved both our lives with knowledge you shouldn't possess. That night, as Elizabeth lay wrapped in Morningstar's blanket, she wondered if the woman whose identity she had borrowed was somehow still present, still protecting the man she had loved in life. The thought should have been frightening, but instead Elizabeth found it oddly comforting. Maybe the dead did watch over the living after all. On the fourth morning, Elizabeth woke to an ominous silence. The smoke from the bandits' campfire, which had been visible on the horizon for days, was gone. She sat up quickly and looked around, but there was no sign of Rodriguez and his men anywhere. Thomas, she whispered urgently, shaking him awake. They're gone. Thomas was instantly alert, scanning the desert in all directions. No, he said grimly. They're not gone. They're closer. Before Elizabeth could ask what he meant, the thunder of hoofbeats filled the air. But this time the sound was coming from multiple directions. The bandits had split up and were approaching their camp from 3 sides, cutting off any possibility of escape. "They're trying to surround us," Thomas said, standing and reaching for his rifle. "Something has changed. Rodriguez has made up his mind about something." Elizabeth felt ice in her veins. "What do we do?" "Whatever happens, stay in character," Thomas said urgently. "If this is our last chance to convince them, we have to make it count." The bandits rode into the camp like a storm, their horses kicking up clouds of dust and their weapons drawn. Rodriguez was in the lead, his face set in hard lines. Behind him rode Carlos, Diego, and 3 other men Elizabeth hadn't seen up close before. But there was something different about the way they approached this time. Instead of the casual arrogance they had shown before, the bandits looked nervous, almost afraid. Their eyes kept darting to Elizabeth, and several of them were making the sign of the cross. "Thomas Crow Feather," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with tension. "We need to settle this question about your wife once and for all." Thomas stepped protectively in front of Elizabeth, his hand resting on his gun. "What question?" "You've seen her. You've spoken with her. What more do you need?" Rodriguez dismounted, but he kept his distance from Elizabeth. "We've been talking, my men and I. Some of them think she's really Morningstar returned from the dead. Others think you're playing an elaborate trick on us." He gestured toward Carlos and Diego. "These 2 believe in spirits and magic. But the others," he pointed to the 3 men Elizabeth didn't recognize, "they think you're hiding the woman who escaped from the stagecoach. They think you've disguised her to look like your dead wife." Elizabeth continued grinding corn, but her hands were shaking so badly that the stone slipped several times. This was the confrontation they had been dreading. All their careful preparation was about to be put to the ultimate test. "There's only one way to settle this," Rodriguez continued. "If this woman is really Morningstar's spirit, she'll be able to prove it. If she's just a clever disguise, we'll know that too." Thomas's voice was steady, but Elizabeth could hear the underlying tension. "What kind of proof do you want?" Rodriguez smiled, but it was a cruel expression. "Carlos tells me that Morningstar used to sing a special song. A mourning song for the Apache dead. He says she had the most beautiful voice he ever heard, and that the song could make grown men cry." Elizabeth's blood turned to ice. She had never heard this song, had no idea how it was supposed to sound. Even if Morningstar's spirit had somehow helped her with the Spanish words, how could she possibly sing a song she had never learned? "Sing the song," Rodriguez commanded, looking directly at Elizabeth. "If you are really Morningstar, you will remember the words and the melody. If you are not—" He let the threat hang in the air unfinished. Elizabeth looked at Thomas, desperation in her eyes. He gave her the smallest nod, encouraging her to try, but she could see that he was as lost as she was. Slowly, Elizabeth stood up and faced the bandits. 6 pairs of eyes stared at her, some hopeful, some suspicious, all waiting to see if she would expose herself as a fraud. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her throat was completely dry and her mind was blank. She had no idea how to begin, what words to use, what melody to follow. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Elizabeth could see Rodriguez's hand moving toward his gun. The other bandits were growing restless, muttering among themselves. Then, just as she thought all hope was lost, Elizabeth felt something strange happening. The turquoise necklace around her throat grew warm against her skin, and suddenly words began forming in her mind. Not English words or Spanish words, but Apache words in a melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her memory. Without understanding how or why, Elizabeth began to sing. The song that came from her lips was unlike anything she had ever heard before. It was hauntingly beautiful, and filled with such profound sadness that it seemed to reach into the very souls of everyone who heard it. The melody rose and fell like the wind through canyon walls, and the Apache words flowed from her mouth as if she had been born speaking the language. As she sang, Elizabeth could see the effect the song was having on the bandits. Carlos had tears streaming down his face. Diego had removed his hat and was holding it over his heart. Even the hardest of the men looked moved by the music. But it was Rodriguez's reaction that mattered most. The gang leader stood frozen, his hand no longer reaching for his weapon. His face had gone pale, and his eyes were wide with something that looked like recognition and fear. The song seemed to last forever and end too soon at the same time. When the last note faded into the desert silence, no one moved or spoke for a long moment. Finally, Carlos broke the silence. "That was it," he whispered. "That was Morning Star's song. Exactly as I remember it." Rodriguez was still staring at Elizabeth, but now his expression was one of awe rather than suspicion. "Where did you learn that song?" he asked quietly. Elizabeth felt the words coming to her again, though she didn't know where they originated. "I learned it from my grandmother, Esperanza, when I was a child. It is the song our people sing when someone dies too young, when love is cut short by fate." Her voice was different now, carrying an accent and cadence that sounded nothing like her normal speech. It was as if someone else was speaking through her. "The song carries the spirits of all the women who have lost their loves before their time," Elizabeth continued. "When I died, the song followed me to the world beyond. When I returned, I brought it back with me." The bandits were completely silent now. Even the horses seemed to sense that something supernatural was happening, and stood perfectly still. Rodriguez finally found his voice. "You are Morning Star," he said, and it was a statement, not a question. Only she could sing that song with such feeling. Only she could make it sound like the voices of the dead themselves. Elizabeth nodded slowly, still feeling as if she was not entirely in control of her own actions. "I am what remains of her love, what could not rest in death." Rodriguez backed away from her, and Elizabeth could see genuine fear in his eyes now. "Forgive us for doubting you," he said. "We meant no disrespect to the spirits." "You are forgiven," Elizabeth replied in that strange, otherworldly voice. "But you must leave this place now. The dead do not like to be disturbed by the living for too long." The bandits didn't need to be told twice. They mounted their horses quickly, their movements urgent and nervous. But before they could ride away, Rodriguez turned back to Thomas. "We're leaving the territory," he said, "heading south to Mexico. Too much strange business happening around here lately. First the woman who vanished from the stagecoach without a trace, now spirits walking among the living. It's time to find a new place to work." As the bandits rode away, their horses moving faster than necessary, Elizabeth felt whatever had been controlling her actions slowly fade away. She swayed on her feet, suddenly exhausted, and Thomas caught her arm to steady her. "How did you know that song?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder and a little fear. Elizabeth touched the necklace with trembling fingers. "I didn't know it. I still don't know it. But when I started to sing, it was like someone else was singing through me." Thomas looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That was Morning Star's song. Word for word, note for note, exactly as she used to sing it. There's no way you could have known it unless..." "Unless what?" "Unless she really is helping you somehow," Thomas finished quietly. Elizabeth felt a strange mixture of relief and confusion. They had fooled the bandits completely, but she wasn't sure what had actually happened or how she had been able to sing a song she had never learned. One thing was certain, though. Rodriguez and his gang were leaving the territory, which meant she was finally safe. The masquerade was over, and she could stop pretending to be Morning Star. But as she looked at Thomas and saw the complicated emotions playing across his face, Elizabeth realized that ending the pretense might be more difficult than she had expected. The silence after the bandits rode away was deafening. Elizabeth stood in the middle of their camp, still wearing Morning Star's clothes and necklace, feeling like she was caught between two worlds. The immediate danger was over, but something had fundamentally changed during those final moments of deception. Thomas was looking at her with an expression she had never seen before. There was gratitude there and relief, but also something deeper and more complex, something that made her heart beat faster. "It's over," Elizabeth said quietly, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. "Yes," Thomas replied, but he didn't sound entirely happy about it. "Rodriguez and his men are gone. You're safe now." Elizabeth nodded and began to reach for the clasp of Morning Star's necklace. It was time to return it to Thomas. Time to take off the borrowed clothes and become Elizabeth Carter again. Time to continue her journey to Tucson and the life that waited for her there. But when her fingers touched the turquoise stones, she hesitated. The necklace had become more than just a disguise to her. It had become a connection to a woman she had never met but felt she somehow knew. A woman whose strength and love had somehow reached across death to help save Elizabeth's life. "I should give this back to you," Elizabeth said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas stepped closer to her, close enough that she could see the pain and hope warring in his dark eyes. "What if you didn't?" Elizabeth's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "What if you kept the necklace? What if you stayed? Thomas's voice was gentle but urgent. What if the pretense didn't have to end? Elizabeth stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. But I'm not her. I'm not Morningstar, I'm just Elizabeth. A woman from Phoenix who worked in a general store and had no idea what she wanted to do with her life. Thomas reached up and gently touched her face, his calloused fingers tracing the line of her cheek. You're right, you're not Morningstar. But these past few days, watching you find courage you didn't know you had, seeing you learn to read the desert and move like you were born to this life. You've become someone new. Someone strong and brave and beautiful. Elizabeth felt tears threatening to spill over. I don't know how to be an Apache wife. I don't know how to live in the desert, how to survive out here. I could teach you, Thomas said softly, if you wanted to learn, if you wanted to stay. Elizabeth looked around at the vast expanse of desert that surrounded them. A week ago, this landscape had seemed hostile and terrifying. Now it felt like home in a way that no place ever had before. What about Morningstar? Elizabeth asked. Wouldn't staying here wearing her necklace be like trying to replace her? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering her question. I've been thinking about that. At first, yes, it felt like betrayal. But these past few days I've realized something important. You're not trying to replace Morningstar. You're helping me remember that love doesn't have to end with death. He took her hands in his touch warm and steady. Morningstar will always be part of who I am. But that doesn't mean I have to spend the rest of my life living like a ghost. Maybe her spirit brought you to me not to replace what I lost, but to help me find something new. Elizabeth felt the truth of his words resonating in her chest. She had been running away from an empty life in Phoenix, but she hadn't been running toward anything. Now, for the first time, she could see a future that excited her instead of frightening her. I don't know anything about being married, she admitted. I've never even been seriously courted by anyone. Thomas smiled, and Elizabeth realized it was the first time she had seen him look truly happy. We'll figure it out together. Besides, Apache marriages are different from white marriages. They're based on mutual respect and partnership, not ownership. Elizabeth thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. The stagecoach attack that had seemed like the end of the world. The desperate flight through the desert. The terrifying days of deception that had somehow transformed into something beautiful and real. If I stay, she said slowly, if I become your wife for real instead of just pretending, what kind of life would we have? Thomas's eyes lit up as he began to describe the possibilities. We could build a cabin in the mountains near water and good hunting. I could teach you to track and shoot and identify the plants that can heal or feed us. You could teach me about the books and learning you had in your old life. Elizabeth could picture it clearly. A simple life, but a meaningful one. A life where she would matter to someone, where her strength and intelligence would be needed and valued. We could help people, Thomas continued. Travelers who get lost in the desert, settlers who need guides, people caught between the Apache and white worlds like we are. We could be a bridge between both communities. Elizabeth realized that tears were streaming down her face, but they were tears of joy, not sadness. For the first time in her life, someone was offering her not just security or companionship, but a true partnership, a chance to build something meaningful together. The territorial marshal will still need my tracking services sometimes, Thomas said, but we could make our own choices about which jobs to take. We could refuse to help anyone who wants to harm innocent people. Elizabeth nodded, understanding what he meant. They would never again have to compromise their principles for survival. Slowly, deliberately, Elizabeth reached up and unfastened Morningstar's necklace from around her throat. For a moment, Thomas looked stricken, thinking she was going to return it to him and leave. Instead, Elizabeth held the necklace up to catch the desert sunlight, watching the turquoise stones glow like pieces of captured sky. Morningstar, she said quietly, speaking to the spirit she felt sure was listening somehow. Thank you for lending me your strength when I needed it most. Thank you for helping me find my way to the man you loved, and for showing me that love can be stronger than death. She paused, feeling the weight of the moment. I promise to honor your memory by loving him well, by being the partner he deserves, and by living the kind of life you would have wanted for him. Then Elizabeth fastened the necklace around her throat again, but this time it felt different. It was no longer a disguise or a borrowed identity. It was a gift from one woman to another, a blessing from the past to help build a future. Thomas pulled her into his arms then, holding her close against his chest. Elizabeth could hear his heart beating strong and steady, and she knew that this was where she belonged. "Are you sure?" he whispered into her hair. "Once we do this, there's no going back to your old life." Elizabeth pulled back to look into his eyes. "I don't want to go back. I want to go forward with you." Thomas kissed her then, gentle and reverent, like she was something precious and sacred. When they broke apart, Elizabeth felt like a different person than the frightened woman who had fled through the desert just a week ago. "What do we do now?" she asked. Thomas smiled and gestured toward the east, where the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains. "Now we go home. Our home." As they packed up their camp and prepared to leave the place where their deception had become truth, Elizabeth felt Morningstar's presence one last time. It was like a warm breeze that touched her face, carrying with it a sense of approval and peace. The spirit that had helped her through the darkest moments was finally ready to rest. Thomas loaded their few belongings onto his horse and helped Elizabeth mount behind him. As they rode away from the creek bed where they had spent those dangerous, transformative days, Elizabeth looked back one last time at the place where she had learned who she really was. "No regrets?" Thomas asked, feeling her turn in the saddle. Elizabeth wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed her cheek against his back. "None at all." They rode east toward the mountains, toward the life they would build together. Behind them, the desert wind began to erase all traces of their camp, leaving only the memory of a love that had been strong enough to bridge the gap between life and death, between two lonely souls who had found each other in the vastness of the Arizona territory. In the years that followed, people would sometimes tell stories about the Apache tracker and his mysterious wife who appeared out of nowhere. Some said she was a spirit made flesh. Others claimed she was a woman who had died and been reborn. But Thomas and Elizabeth knew the truth was simpler and more beautiful than any legend. They had saved each other's lives in more ways than one, and in doing so, they had discovered that sometimes the greatest gift we can give another person is the chance to become who they were always meant to be. As the sun set behind them and the stars began to appear in the vast desert sky, Elizabeth touched the turquoise necklace at her throat and whispered a silent thank you to the woman whose love had made their happiness possible. Somewhere in the wind that whispered through the canyon walls, she could swear she heard the faint echo of laughter, joyful and free.